The air in Alara Vance's studio was a sacred thing, thick with the ghosts of forgotten journeys. It smelled of brittle paper, of linseed oil, and the faint, sweet decay of leather bindings. Dust motes danced like constellations in the single beam of late-afternoon sun that pierced the grimy arched window, illuminating the delicate tremor in her hand as she guided a brush tipped with adhesive along a fractured coastline. At 24, her entire world had been distilled into this quiet, sun-drenched room above a forgotten Boston bookstore. Here, she was not the fragile Vance heir, but a creator, a healer of broken worlds. She mended the torn rivers and faded continents of 17th-century maps with a reverence that bordered on worship, her focus so absolute that it silenced the persistent, hollow echo in her own soul. This precision was her only armor, a fragile shield against a life that felt alien to her. If you want to know what happens when this carefully controlled world is shattered by a man who sees the cracks in her armor, watch until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and comment on where you are watching from. We continue. Alara was a creature of soft edges and muted colors, as if she were perpetually trying to fade into the background. Her long, pale hair was often tied back in a simple knot, and her clothes were chosen for comfort and practicality, not to draw the eye. Her work as a specialist in antique cartographic restoration was more than a profession. It was a reflection of her own fragmented identity. With painstaking patience, she would realign the delicate filigree of a compass rose, or rebuild a coastline shattered by time, finding a profound, if temporary, sense of wholeness in the act. Each map was a silent confidant, a world that demanded nothing from her but her skill and allowed her to pour her silent passion into its fragile veins. She could spend hours tracing the ink of a long-dead cartographer, feeling a kinship with him that she never felt with the living, breathing people in her own orbit. Her virginity was not a choice born of piety or principle, but a fortress built brick by brick from the rubble of a youthful trust that had been carelessly broken. The memory was a faded watercolor, blurred at the edges but potent in its sting, leaving behind a deep-seated terror of intimacy that felt insurmountable. It was a physical and emotional cage she inhabited, making her flinch from even the most casual touch. Her body was a foreign land, with borders she was too afraid to let anyone cross, a map she herself had never dared to explore. This untouched state was a testament to her isolation, a quiet, shameful secret in a world that equated experience with life. For Alara, the mere thought of surrendering that control, of being seen and touched with vulnerability, was a vertigo-inducing drop into an abyss she was certain she would not survive. The Vance name was a gilded cage of its own, a legacy built on old money and brittle pride that was now threatening to crumble into dust. Their family mansion on Beacon Hill was less a home and more a mausoleum, each room a perfectly preserved exhibit of past glories. The air was cold, smelling of lemon polish and unspoken anxieties. Here, Alara was an artifact to be polished and presented, her feelings and desires irrelevant to the larger goal of maintaining the family's precarious social standing. Conversations were transactions, and affection was a currency sparingly spent. She moved through the silent, opulent halls like a ghost, her presence acknowledged but her essence unseen, her quiet nature mistaken for compliance. She was the family's most valuable and most fragile asset, and they were preparing to sell her to the highest bidder. Every morning her life felt like a script she had not memorized, a role for which she was horribly miscast. The quiet journey from the oppressive stillness of her family's home to the sanctuary of her studio was a daily gasp for air. She would watch the city wake up from behind the glass of a taxi, a silent observer of a world she didn't belong to, a world of easy laughter, of hands held without fear, of futures chosen instead of dictated. The engagement to Carter Redding, a man as bland and predictable as his family's portfolio, loomed over her like a guillotine. It was presented not as a union of love, but as a strategic merger, a duty she was expected to perform for the survival of the Vance name. She felt a profound sense of disassociation, as if she were watching a film of someone else's life, powerless to change the tragic, inevitable ending. Only within the fragile paper worlds of her maps did she find a semblance of freedom. They were not just ink and parchment, they were promises of elsewhere. She would trace the routes of ancient mariners who had sailed into the unknown, their courage a stark contrast to her own suffocating fear. She could lose herself for hours in the intricate details of a mythical beast lurking in the corner of an unexplored ocean, or the elegant script detailing a newly discovered land. In her studio, she was the master of these domains. She decided which coastlines would be saved, which faded legends would be brought back to life. This power, this ability to restore and heal, was a potent antidote to the helplessness that defined the rest of her existence. These maps were the only place she could invest her heart without the terrifying risk of it being broken. As the day's light began to fade, casting long, melancholic shadows across her work table, the quiet would return, and with it, the familiar ache of loneliness. And Lara would stand by the window looking down at the bustling street below. She saw couples walking hand in hand, their intimacy a language she couldn't comprehend. She saw friends sharing secrets over coffee, their easy camaraderie, a world away from her own stilted family dinners. The walls of her studio, once a protective cocoon, were beginning to feel more like the sealed-off chamber of a tomb. The carefully constructed peace she had built for herself was a fragile illusion, and she could feel the cracks spreading through its foundation. A desperate, unspoken question hung in the dusty air. Was this all her life would ever be? A silent, lonely vigil over the beautiful, broken things of the past. The Vance mansion on Beacon Hill was not a home. It was a testament to a glory that had long since faded into a brittle, sepia-toned memory. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the heavy, damask curtains, and when it did, it seemed to lose its warmth, illuminating dust motes in the cold, still air. The floors of polished mahogany reflected the stern, oil-painted faces of ancestors whose gazes followed Ilara down the cavernous hallways, their silent judgment a constant, oppressive weight. Every object was perfectly placed, every surface gleamed with a sterile polish. But there was no life here. The silence was the loudest thing in the house, a vast, echoing void that swallowed sound and emotion with equal finality. It was a beautiful, opulent tomb, and Ilara often felt she was just another one of its carefully preserved artifacts, waiting for her value to be appraised. Her mother, Beatrice, was the chief curator of this family museum. A woman sculpted from ice and iron will, she moved through the silent rooms with a rustle of silk and an air of perpetual, managed disappointment. Her love was conditional, a currency dispensed for obedience and withdrawn for the slightest infraction of their unspoken code. "Ilara, your posture," she would murmur without looking up from her correspondence, the words a gentle but firm correction, a reminder that Ilara's body was a public asset. "Carter's mother will be at the symphony benefit. We must present a united, polished front." Beatrice never raised her voice. Her power lay in the quiet, suffocating pressure of her expectations, a constant, gentle shaping of Ilara into the daughter she needed her to be, not the woman she was. This need was rooted in the crushing weight of their legacy. The Vance name had once been synonymous with Boston's foundational power, whispered in the same breath as Cabot's and Lowell's. Now it was little more than a historical footnote, a name that opened doors to clubs they could no longer afford and secured invitations to galas that served only to highlight their decline. For Ilara, this history was not a source of pride, but a litany of obligations. She was the last, best hope of shoring up the crumbling facade. Her marriage was not a personal milestone, but a dynastic necessity, a final, desperate move to graft their wilting family tree onto the robust, unblemished stock of the Redding fortune. Her happiness was a small, insignificant price to pay for the preservation of the Vance name. The rot, of course, was financial. It was a secret kept with the ferocity of a state secret, a cancer eating away at the family's foundations, while they maintained a flawless exterior. Ilara saw the truth in the furtive, hushed phone calls her father took in his study, the door firmly closed. She saw it in the way her mother's smile became a little more brittle when the monthly statements arrived, and in the strategic liquidation of certain assets, a minor painting here, a parcel of land there, always framed as prudent estate management. The unspoken terror was not of poverty, but of irrelevance. It was the fear of becoming the generation that let the Vance legacy die, a failure so profound that sacrificing one daughter's future seemed not only reasonable, but necessary. Carter Redding was the face of their salvation. Ilara had met him a handful of times at curated, sterile social functions. He was handsome in a forgettable catalog model way, with a polite smile that never reached his eyes, and a conversation that revolved around sailing, stock portfolios, and the tedious politics of his father's firm. Her family spoke of him in terms of assets, his impeccable lineage, his stable temperament, his considerable inheritance. He was described as a good, solid choice, a safe harbor. To Alara, he was a void, a blank space onto which her future was being written without her consent. The thought of being his wife, of sharing a bed with this polite stranger, did not inspire passion or even mild affection, but a deep, chilling sense of erasure. Family dinners were exercises in performance art. Seated at the long, imposing dining table, Alara would listen to her parents discuss the wedding arrangements as if she were not present. They debated floral arrangements, guest lists, and the strategic seating of influential figures, with the detached precision of generals planning a campaign. Alara would retreat into herself, creating intricate patterns with her fork in the mashed potatoes, her silence mistaken for demure agreement. The clinking of silver against bone china was the only punctuation in a conversation from which she was entirely excluded. She was the subject, the prize, the sacrificial lamb, but she was not a participant. She was an object being moved into its final, permanent position, and her own feelings on the matter were entirely irrelevant. Her work, her sanctuary, was increasingly framed as a liability. "This little hobby of yours is charming, Alara," her father had said one evening, peering into her studio as if it were a curious diorama. "But soon, you'll have a household to run, a husband to support. Your responsibilities will be here." The casual dismissal of the one place she felt whole was like a physical blow. He didn't see the skill, the passion, the history she held in her hands. He saw a childish diversion, a messy and unprofitable pastime that was beneath the station of the future Mrs. Carter Redding. They wanted to sand down her edges, to pack away the parts of her that didn't fit into the perfect, gilded box they had built for her future. The pressure extended beyond the cold walls of her home. It was in the air of the exclusive circles they moved in. At charity luncheons and gallery openings, she felt the assessing glances of other society matrons, their eyes cataloging her dress, her manners, her suitability. The congratulations on her engagement felt less like genuine well wishes and more like the final stamping of an approval document. She was now officially off the market, a successful transaction completed. The world she inhabited was a web of unspoken rules and rigid expectations, a place where authenticity was a weakness and conformity was the highest virtue. She smiled, she nodded, she played her part, all the while feeling a silent scream building in her chest, a desperate cry for an escape she couldn't begin to imagine. In the stolen hours of the late evening, after the house had fallen into its deep, oppressive slumber, Alara would retreat to her studio. It was her only act of quiet rebellion. She would lock the door, a gesture of defiance against a family that believed they owned every part of her, and unroll a map not for restoration but for escape. Her fingers would trace the rugged coastlines of Patagonia or the vast, empty deserts of the Silk Road. She would imagine a life of anonymity and freedom, a life where her hands were stained with pigment and soil, not constrained by white gloves. A single tear once fell, landing silently on the faded blue of the Arabian Sea, a tiny, salty offering to a world she was certain she would never know. The final seal on her fate arrived via courier one crisp autumn afternoon. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope containing the formal invitation to her own engagement party. The calligraphy was exquisite, the cardstock heavy with the weight of tradition and expectation. Her name, Alara Catherine Vance, was entwined with his, Carter Alistair Redding III, in elegant, looping script. It was no longer a distant, abstract concept. It was here, in black and white, a beautifully printed contract for the sale of her soul. Holding it in her hands, the air in the silent hallway seemed to thin, the walls closing in around her. The path ahead was no longer a vague threat. It was a clearly marked, inescapable route, and she was trapped on it. The intrusion came not as a gradual creep, but as a sharp, definitive crack in the sacred silence of her afternoon. A knock. Not the shuffling, hesitant rap of the bookstore owner from downstairs, but 3 distinct, authoritative strikes against the heavy oak of her studio door. The sound was alien here, a percussive violation of the room's gentle, dusty peace. Alara's hand froze mid-stroke, a droplet of adhesive hanging precariously from her brush. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. No one ever came here unannounced. This space was her hermitage, its location a secret she guarded fiercely. The knock came again, harder this time, impatient and unyielding. It was the sound of the outside world demanding entry, a world she had so carefully managed to keep at bay, and it filled her with a sudden, inexplicable dread. She moved toward the door with the cautious steps of someone approaching a wild, unpredictable animal. Her hand trembled as she turned the old brass knob, the metal cool against her suddenly damp skin. When she pulled the door inward, the man standing in the narrow, dimly lit hallway seemed to consume all the available light and air. He was tall, dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that was a severe architectural statement against the crumbling plaster of the building. But it wasn't his clothes or his striking, severe features that held her captive. It was his stillness. A predatory, absolute stillness that seemed to hum with contained power. His eyes, the color of a winter storm, swept over her, not with the polite disinterest she was accustomed to, but with a cool, analytical intensity that felt as if it were cataloging every one of her vulnerabilities. He was a creature of steel and glass, and he had just stepped into her fragile world of paper and ink. Elara Vance, he stated, his voice a low, resonant baritone that vibrated in the small space. It was not a question. The name hung in the air between them, a name she had only ever heard spoken with the hushed, resentful reverence reserved for Boston's old guard, or, in this man's case, the new predators who circled them. Julian Thorne, the Vulture. A destroyer of companies, a man who had famously dismantled his own family's corrupt empire to rebuild it in his own ruthless image. He didn't smile or offer a hand. He simply held her gaze, and in that unblinking stare, she felt the full, unnerving weight of his reputation. His eyes moved past her shoulder, scanning the interior of her studio with a quick, appraising glance that missed nothing, from the priceless celestial charts on the wall to the faint tremor in her hand. He carried a long, cylindrical case crafted from what looked like polished rosewood and antique brass. He stepped past her, an invasion she was powerless to stop, and placed the tube on her central work table with a quiet, deliberate thud that seemed to echo in the room's stillness. The gesture was one of ownership, as if he already commanded the space. "I was told you are the best," he said, his back partially to her as he undid the clasps. The only one, in fact. He spoke without preamble, the words clipped and efficient, stripped of all social nicety. "I have acquired a piece. The Carta Marina Incognita. It requires attention." His gaze flickered from the case to her hands, and for a brief, unsettling moment, the cold assessment in his eyes was replaced by something else, a flicker of intense, focused curiosity that was somehow more unnerving than his power. Alara's breath caught in her throat. The Carta Marina Incognita was a myth, a legendary sea chart known only through historical correspondence, rumored to be lost for centuries. The cartographer in her, the scholar, was electrified. A jolt of pure academic passion shot through her, a desire so strong it momentarily eclipsed her fear. But the woman, the fragile, cloistered creature, recoiled from the man's sheer force of will. His presence was a raw, masculine energy that felt abrasive against the soft, muted textures of her life. He was everything she had been conditioned to avoid. New money, unpredictable, dangerous. Her instinct screamed at her to refuse, to protect the sanctity of her refuge, to send this man and his disruptive power back out into the world where they belonged. But the allure of the map was a powerful, seductive whisper, a promise of discovery she feared she was too weak to resist. With a final click, he opened the case. The scent that uncoiled into the air was one of deep time, of salt-laced vellum and forgotten voyages. He unrolled the map with a surprising, almost tender care, his large hands moving with a grace that seemed at odds with his brutal reputation. The parchment was a beautiful ruin, its coastlines fractured, its colors faded by water and age. As his fingers, long and immaculate, traced the faded outline of a kraken lurking in the depths of a nameless ocean, Elara saw the first real crack in his formidable armor. The cold, transactional mask fell away for a fraction of a second, and in its place was a look of profound, almost painful connection to the object before them. This wasn't just an acquisition for him, it was a reclamation. This map held a piece of his history, a wound he was determined to mend. She stepped closer, drawn in against her will, her professional curiosity overriding her personal terror. As she leaned over the vast expanse of the chart, a strand of her pale hair falling across her cheek, she became acutely aware of his gaze on her. It was not the vague, polite look of Carter Redding, or the critical, assessing stare of her parents. Julian Thorne watched her with an unwavering, predatory focus that felt like a physical weight on her skin. He wasn't just looking. He was absorbing her, studying the intent line of her brow, the delicate, precise way she held her body, the quiet reverence in her posture. It was a gaze that bypassed all her carefully constructed defenses and aimed directly at the core of her. For the first time in her life, she felt utterly, terrifyingly seen, and the sensation was a dizzying mix of panic and a strange, forbidden thrill. Her training took over, a familiar comfort in the face of this overwhelming presence. "The vellum is desiccated here," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "The iron gall ink has corroded the substrate." To indicate a particularly fragile tear near an ornate compass rose, she reached out, her fingers hovering just above the ancient surface. At the same instant, his own hand moved to point out the same flaw. For a single searing moment, the tips of his fingers brushed against hers. The contact was feather-light, accidental, yet it sent a bolt of pure, unadulterated shock through her system. It was a spark of heat in her cold, untouched world. He retracted his hand as if burned, his expression instantly shuddering, but she saw the muscle that clenched in his jaw. The air between them grew heavy, charged with the unspoken energy of that fleeting, forbidden touch. He straightened up, his professional mask sliding perfectly back into place, though the intensity in his eyes remained. He named a price for her services, a figure so staggeringly high it made her feel lightheaded. It was a sum that could not only secure the Vance legacy for another generation, but could buy her an entirely new life, a world away from Beacon Hill and its gilded obligations. But she understood with chilling certainty that the money was secondary. He was purchasing more than her skill. "You will work only on this," he stated, his voice low and unequivocal. "Here, I will provide for anything you need, but your time, until this is complete, is mine." He was not making a request. He was dictating terms. He was commissioning a restoration, but he was also demanding her seclusion, claiming her focus, her time, her world, as his exclusive domain. Elara stood frozen in the sudden, ringing silence. Her meticulously planned future, a straight, unbending line leading to Carter Redding and a life of quiet compliance, now had a stark, terrifying deviation point. To accept this man's offer was an act of profound transgression. It was a secret she would have to guard, a hidden life she would lead in the very heart of her sanctuary. It meant defying the unspoken rules of her world and placing her trust in a man known for his ruthlessness. Yet, as she looked from the fractured beauty of the map, a broken world waiting to be made whole, to the dark, compelling eyes of Julian Thorne, a dangerous, thrilling seed of rebellion began to germinate in the barren soil of her soul. For the first time she was faced with a choice that was entirely her own, and her silence was the answer he was waiting for. The days that followed settled into a strange, new rhythm, a silent pas de deux choreographed around the vast, damaged map. Julian Thorne would arrive precisely at noon, his presence a stark, modern slash against the room's gentle antiquity. He never spoke much in those first hours. He would take a seat in the worn leather armchair in the corner, a place that soon became exclusively his, and simply watch. Elara initially found his unblinking observation unnerving, a pressure that made her delicate work feel clumsy. But gradually she began to realize his gaze was different from the critical assessments of her family. He wasn't evaluating her performance or her suitability. He was watching the process, the alchemy of her craft, with an intensity that felt less like judgment and more like a form of profound, focused respect. It was a novel sensation, to be observed without being appraised. This silent companionship began to reshape the very air in her studio. His presence, once an intrusion, became a grounding force, The scent of his expensive cologne, a clean, sharp fragrance of bergamot and cedar, mingled with the familiar smells of old paper and linseed oil, creating a new, uniquely intoxicating atmosphere. She learned the subtle cues of his stillness, the slight shift in his posture when she undertook a particularly delicate repair, the way his jaw would clench when she worked close to a section of the map that held some hidden meaning for him. He was a silent partner in her work, his energy a protective barrier against the anxieties that waited for her outside these four walls. In his presence, the looming specter of Carter Redding and the oppressive weight of her family's expectations seemed to recede, becoming distant, muffled echoes from another world. The first true fissure in their carefully maintained distance happened on a rain-swept afternoon. Ilara was attempting to readhere a fragile, flaking piece of vellum depicting a siren, her tweezers held with a surgeon's precision. Her other hand, braced on the table, slipped on a stray drop of distilled water. With a speed that seemed impossible for a man of his size and stillness, Julian was out of his chair and beside her, his hand closing over hers to steady it just inches from the map. His touch was not gentle. It was firm, warm, and absolute, a current of raw energy that shot straight through her, lighting up nerves that had lain dormant her entire life. The world narrowed to that single point of contact, the heat of his palm against the back of her hand, the strength in his fingers a stark contrast to her own trembling. They remained frozen for a long, breathless moment, his hand covering hers, the air thick with unspoken words. Ilara could feel the steady, powerful thrum of his pulse against her skin, a rhythm that seemed to be pulling her own frantic heartbeat into sync with it. When she finally dared to lift her eyes to his, the cool, analytical mask was gone. In its place was something raw and unguarded, a turbulent storm of an emotion she couldn't name but felt in the deepest part of her soul. It was a look of intense, almost painful possession, as if in that single touch he had laid a claim on her that defied all logic and convention. He released her hand abruptly, stepping back as if the contact had burned him, his expression once again shuttered and impenetrable. But the brand of his touch lingered on her skin, a phantom heat she would feel for days. He began to bring things. It started with a high-powered, articulated lamp, the kind used by jewelers, which he installed himself with a quiet, focused efficiency. "The light in here is inadequate," was his only explanation. Then came a small, silent espresso machine, along with pods of a dark, rich coffee that filled the studio with its robust aroma each afternoon. One evening, when she was working late, a courier delivered a simple but elegant meal. Not the extravagant fare of her world, but warm, nourishing food that felt like a quiet act of care. These were not gifts meant to charm or impress. They were practical, almost clinical provisions. Yet for Ilara, who had been raised on conditional affection and transactional love, these simple, unspoken gestures of consideration were more intimate than any compliment she had ever received. They were acknowledgments of her needs, not her value. The silence between them gradually began to fill with sound, not of small talk, but of stories drawn from the ink and parchment before them. "This cartographer, Olaus Magnus," Julian said one evening, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. He filled the empty spaces not with warnings, but with wonders. He believed the unknown was something to be marveled at, not feared. He spoke of the history of exploration, of the political ambitions and secret desires hidden in the flourishes of a compass rose or the naming of a new continent. Ilara found herself responding, sharing her own knowledge, her voice gaining a confidence she rarely felt outside her studio. They were not talking about themselves, not directly, but in sharing the secret language of the map, they were revealing the deepest parts of their own natures, his fascination with conquering the unknown, and her reverence for preserving its fragile beauty. As they worked into the deepening twilight, the map became a confessional. Pointing to a coastline crudely redrawn by a later hand, Julian's voice took on a harder edge. "My ancestor was a man who believed in rewriting history to suit his own narrative," he said, the words clipped. "He stole this map, and the legacy it represented, because he was too weak to build his own." It was the first time he had spoken of his family, and the bitterness in his tone was a raw, open wound. Ilara, in turn, found herself speaking of her own gilded cage. her voice soft but clear. "My family believes in preserving a history that no longer exists," she confessed, her eyes on the faded coastlines. "Even if it means sacrificing the future to do so." In that shared moment of vulnerability, the space between them shrank, the professional boundary dissolving into something far more perilous and profound. These clandestine hours became the most real part of Ilara's existence, a vibrant secret life lived in the heart of her sanctuary. The rest of her world, the world of fittings for her wedding gown and polite sterile dinners with the Reddings, felt like a poorly rehearsed play. The contrast between the two men who laid claim to her future was a constant, jarring dissonance. Carter spoke of their future in terms of property acquisitions and social calendars. His touch, when he took her arm, was proprietary and lifeless. Julian, who had never touched her again after that first searing contact, held her more completely with a single, intense glance. The thought of marrying Carter, once a grim inevitability, now felt like a betrayal of the vibrant, feeling woman who was slowly, terrifyingly coming to life in Julian Thorne's presence. The guilt was a sharp, persistent ache in her chest. She was deceiving everyone. Her parents, who saw her obedience as their salvation. Carter, who for all his blandness, deserved more than a duplicitous fiancé. Every evening she spent with Julian felt like an act of profound transgression, a secret sin that was both terrifying and intoxicating. She would lie awake in her cold, opulent bedroom at the Vance mansion, the phantom heat of Julian's gaze still on her skin, and feel torn in two. One part of her, the dutiful daughter, screamed in protest, warning her of the ruin she was courting. But another, newer voice, a voice that sounded more like her own, whispered that a lifetime of suffocating safety was a far greater ruin than any social disgrace she might face. She began to see the cracks in his armor more frequently. One afternoon, she pricked her finger on the sharp edge of a drafting tool, a tiny ruby of blood welling on her fingertip. Before she could react, Julian was there, his expression a mask of controlled fury, directed not at her but at the inanimate object that had harmed her. He took her hand, his touch surprisingly gentle this time, and examined the minuscule wound with an intensity that was utterly disproportionate to the injury. For a fleeting second, his thumb stroked the side of her palm, a gesture so tender, so unconsciously protective, that it made her breath catch. He seemed to realize what he was doing and dropped her hand, turning away to stare out the window, his back a rigid wall of resistance against an impulse he could no longer completely control. The desire she felt was a foreign, bewildering thing. It was not the vague, romanticized longing she read about in books, but a sharp, specific ache that centered on him. It was the low, resonant timbre of his voice, as he read a Latin inscription from the map. It was the way a lock of his dark hair fell across his forehead when he leaned in to examine her work. It was the scent of his skin, a clean, masculine scent she could sometimes detect when he stood too close. She, Ilara Vance, who had flinched from the most innocent touch her entire life, found herself craving the proximity of this dangerous, emotionally unavailable man. She was beginning to desire the very thing she had built her entire life around avoiding. Intimacy, vulnerability, the terrifying, exhilarating free-fall of surrender. A call from her mother shattered the sanctity of their shared world one late afternoon. Ilara's phone, usually on silent, buzzed on the work table, the name Beatrice Vance glowing on the screen. The sound was a harsh, unwelcome intrusion, a summons from the life she was trying to forget. As she answered, her mother's crisp, cool voice filled the quiet studio, discussing florists and seating charts for the engagement party. Ilara felt Julian's eyes on her, his gaze turning hard and cold as he listened. She saw the muscle in his jaw tighten, his stillness becoming predatory. He was not just hearing her mother's words. He was hearing the chains of her servitude being rattled, and the look on his face was one of pure, possessive fury. When she hung up, the silence that fell was heavier and more charged than ever before. The incident emboldened her. Fueled by a recklessness born of desperation, she began to push at his boundaries, to see how far she could go before he retreated completely. "Why this map, Julian?" she asked one evening, her tone more direct than it had ever been. "It's more than just about clearing your family's name, isn't it?" He turned from the window, his eyes dark and unreadable in the dim light. He didn't answer immediately, studying her as if trying to solve a complex puzzle. "Some things," he finally said, his voice low and rough, "are not stolen. They are surrendered. And the price of getting them back is higher than you can imagine." It was not an answer, but a confession and a warning, and it hung between them, thick with the weight of all the things he refused to say. His resistance was palpable, a constant simmering battle waged within himself. There were moments when he would look at her, and the raw hunger in his eyes was so potent it felt like a physical touch, making the air thin in her lungs. She would see him start to move toward her, to close the small, sacred space that separated them, only to check himself at the last second, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He was fighting his own nature, fighting the pull toward her with the same ruthless control he applied to his business empire. But she could see the strain it was costing him. He was a man accustomed to taking whatever he wanted, and for the first time he wanted something he believed he could not, or should not have. This internal conflict made him even more compelling, his restraint a more powerful aphrodisiac than any overt advance could ever be. Her own dilemma had reached a fever pitch. The choice was no longer an abstract concept about her future. It was a visceral, daily struggle between two opposing forces. On one side was the gilded cage of her impending marriage, a life of predictable comfort, social acceptance, and the slow, certain death of her soul. On the other was Julian, a man who represented a terrifying, unknown wilderness. He offered no promises of safety, no declarations of affection, only a consuming intensity that made her feel more alive than she had ever been. To choose him was to choose chaos, to leap into an abyss without any certainty of a safe landing. But to choose Carter was to willingly walk back into her tomb and allow them to seal the door behind her. The fear was still there, a cold, familiar companion. It whispered to her in the dead of night, reminding her of the pain that came from trusting, from opening herself up to another person. It reminded her of her own fragility, of the deep, unhealed wounds that made her shy away from connection. But now, a new feeling was warring with the fear, a desperate, clawing hunger for life. She looked at her hands, no longer just the steady, precise instruments of her trade, but the hands of a woman who had been touched, who had felt the spark of another's energy. She was standing on the edge of a precipice, and the life she had always known was behind her, pushing her forward. The only question left was whether she would allow herself to fall. Their last session before the weekend of her engagement party ended in a moment of unbearable suspended tension. She was cleaning her brushes, her back to him, when he spoke her name. Ilara. The single word was low and rough, and it vibrated through her entire body. She turned slowly. He was standing much closer than she had realized. So close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He didn't move, he didn't touch her, but his eyes held hers, and in their stormy depths, she saw his control finally, irrevocably shatter. He was looking at her as if she were the only source of light in a world of darkness, with a desperation and a longing that stripped her bare. The air was electric, thick with unspoken promises and imminent transgression. He was going to kiss her. She knew it, and in that terrifying, exhilarating moment, she knew she was going to let him. But he did not kiss her. He simply held her gaze for a long, torturous moment before turning away, the dismissal a more profound rejection than any harsh word. The weekend passed in a blur of suffocating preparations. Now at the engagement party, Ilara felt like a ghost haunting her own life. The air in the opulent ballroom was thick with the scent of lilies and privilege, a sweet, cloying fragrance that made it hard to breathe. Carter, her fiancé, stood beside her, his hand on the small of her back, a proprietary brand. He was regaling a circle of associates with a story, and when the topic of Ilara's profession arose, he laughed, a dismissive, polished sound. "Oh, Ilara's little hobby," he said, patting her back condescendingly. "She's quite clever with her glue and old papers. It will keep her busy." The words, meant to be charming, landed like a death sentence. In that instant, the carefully constructed facade of her compliance shattered into a million irreparable pieces. A sudden, cold clarity washed over her, silencing the cacophony of the room. It was the absolute certainty of a soul pushed past its breaking point. She saw her future spool out before her, a lifetime of being called clever, of being patted and placated, of her passion being reduced to a little hobby to keep her occupied between charity luncheons and yacht club dinners. It was a slow, beautiful, gilded suffocation. Without a word, she turned. She walked away from Carter, from the circle of smiling, empty faces, her movements fluid and deliberate. She did not run. She simply exited, leaving a wake of confused silence behind her. She moved through the grand ballroom, a lone figure in a sea of champagne and whispers, the silk of her gown whispering against the marble floors. Each step was a severing, a cutting of the invisible threads that had bound her to this life, to this name, to this duty. Outside, the Boston night air was a shocking, welcome slap of cold against her heated skin. Rain had begun to fall, a fine, misty drizzle that beaded on her bare shoulders and clung to the elaborate twist of her hair, beginning to dissolve the perfect coiffure. She ignored the doorman's offer to hail her a cab, walking a full block in her delicate heels, the damp pavement soaking through the thin soles. When she finally raised a hand, a yellow taxi materialized out of the gloom. As she sank into the worn vinyl seat, the driver glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his eyes taking in the formal gown and the wild, desperate look in her eyes. But he said nothing. She gave him an address, a place she had only seen from a distance, a tower of glass and steel that pierced the night sky. Julian Thorne's address. The name felt like a prayer and a curse on her lips. The journey through the rain-slicked city was a surreal dream. The familiar, historic streets of Beacon Hill gave way to the stark, modern geometry of the financial district. She watched the city lights smear and refract through the rain-streaked window, her own reflection a pale, ghostly image superimposed over the rushing darkness. She was a runaway bride in a borrowed fairy tale, fleeing not from a monster, but from a life of profound emptiness. There was no logic to her destination, only a deep, primal instinct, a magnetic pull toward the one person who had ever looked at her and seen not an asset, but a living, breathing soul. The fear was a living thing in her chest, a frantic bird beating its wings against her ribs, but beneath it was a stronger, fiercer current of resolve. For the first time, she was not being moved. She was moving. She stood for a long time on the pavement before his building, a shard of dark glass that seemed to absorb the city's light. The wind whipped the fine silk of her dress around her legs, and the cold was beginning to seep into her bones. This was his world. Hard, clean, and uncompromising. It was a fortress, and she had come to its gates with nothing but her own brokenness as an offering. Her hand, when she raised it to the cold, stainless steel intercom, trembled violently. What was she doing? What could she possibly say? For a moment, she almost turned back, the siren call of familiar misery nearly overwhelming her. But then she remembered Carter's dismissive laugh, her mother's cool, appraising eyes, and she pressed the button. The small electric buzz was the sound of a bridge being burned behind her. There was no going back now. He opened the door himself. He was not in a suit, but in a simple dark gray Henley that stretched across his broad shoulders and soft, worn trousers. He was barefoot. The sight of him, so stripped of his corporate armor, was more intimidating than any display of power. His eyes, stormy and intense, took in her appearance in a single, sweeping glance. The rain-dampened hair, the formal gown, the terror and defiance warring on her face. He showed no surprise, only a flicker of something dark and possessive in the depths of his gaze, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. He didn't speak. He simply stepped back, holding the door open wider, an unspoken invitation into the heart of his domain. The silence was not awkward. It was an acknowledgment, a granting of the sanctuary she had so desperately sought. The penthouse was as stark and beautiful as the man who inhabited it. One entire wall was a sheet of glass, revealing a panoramic, godlike view of the storm-swept city below. The space was minimalist, furnished with pieces that were more like sculptures than furniture, all in shades of charcoal, black, and steel. There was no clutter, no sentimentality, only a profound, controlled emptiness that echoed the man himself. Ilara stood shivering in the center of the vast living area, the puddle of her silk gown looking absurdly fragile and out of place. He disappeared for a moment and returned not with champagne, but with a simple, heavy glass of water. He pressed it into her trembling hands, his fingers brushing hers, and the familiar electric shock of his touch was the only warmth in the cold, cavernous room. The simple human gesture broke her. A single, choked sob escaped her lips, and then another. The carefully constructed dam of her composure crumbled, and the words, the feeling she had suppressed for a lifetime, came pouring out in a raw, fragmented torrent. "He called it a hobby," she whispered, the words barely audible over the sound of the wind beating against the glass. "A little thing to keep me busy. They're selling me, Julian. For a name. For a house. I'm just an object. A beautiful, broken thing for their collection." She wasn't looking at him, but at the city lights blurring through her tears. She confessed her deepest fear, not of poverty or social ruin, but of erasure, of living an entire life without ever once being truly seen. He listened, his stillness absolute, his focus a tangible force that held her, letting her shatter completely. When her tears subsided into shuddering silence, he did not touch her or offer empty words of comfort. He simply walked to a hallway and opened a door, revealing a bedroom as Spartan as the rest of the penthouse. On the bed, he had laid out a plain black t-shirt and a pair of soft gray sweatpants. "Change," he said, his voice a low, gentle command. "Leave the dress on the floor." The instruction was symbolic, an order to shed the skin of Ilara Vance, the society bride. He closed the door, giving her the privacy she desperately needed, but she could feel his presence on the other side, a silent, unmovable guardian. In the sterile, unfamiliar bathroom, she peeled off the damp silk gown, letting it fall to the floor like a discarded chrysalis. The simple, clean cotton of his clothes against her skin felt like a benediction. She emerged from the room, small and lost in the clothes that smelled faintly of him, of cedar and clean linen. He was standing by the window, a dark silhouette against the glittering, rain-lashed city. He turned as she approached, and the look on his face stole the air from her lungs. The cold, analytical mask was gone, the ruthless control erased. In its place was a raw, unguarded hunger, a profound, aching loneliness that mirrored her own. It was a look of a man starving who had just been presented with the only thing that could ever nourish him. It was terrifying and beautiful, and it stripped her bare. Her old fears resurfaced, a lifetime of recoiling from intimacy. Panicked, she clutched the soft fabric of his shirt at her collarbone. "Don't," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't look at me like that." He closed the distance between them in 2 long, silent strides, his shadow engulfing her. His voice was a low, rough vow, a promise that resonated in the deepest, most untouched part of her soul. "I will be gentle." And then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of reverence. It was slow and deep and exquisitely tender, a careful, deliberate mapping of her mouth. It was the taste of surrender, the feel of acceptance, the silent, earth-shattering promise that for the first time in her life, she was home. The morning light that filtered into Julian's stark, minimalist bedroom was a cruel, interrogating thing. It was nothing like the soft, dusty gold of her studio. It was a clean, cold, blue-white light that exposed every detail with clinical precision. The severe lines of the furniture, the complete absence of personal effects, the crisp, impersonal scent of the high thread-count sheets. Ilara woke up alone, the space beside her in the vast bed chillingly empty. The memory of his kiss, the impossible tenderness, the low-vowed promise of his voice, felt like a fragile, heat-shimmering dream in the face of this sterile reality. A profound sense of dislocation washed over her. She was a foreign body in this world of steel and glass, a smudge of chaotic emotion in a place where feelings seemed to have been surgically removed. The terrifying question began to echo in the silence. What had she done? He appeared in the doorway not as the man who had held her with such reverence, but as Julian Thorne, the corporate titan. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit, his hair impeccably styled, his face a mask of cool, unreadable composure. The soft Henley and bare feet of the previous night were gone, replaced by impenetrable armor. He carried a small tray, which he placed on a table across the room, creating an immediate and deliberate distance between them. "Coffee," he stated, his voice the same low baritone but now stripped of all its warmth, all its rough tenderness. It was the voice of a man dictating a memo, not one who had mapped the contours of her mouth as if discovering a new world. He didn't look at her for more than a fraction of a second, his gaze already on the tablet in his other hand. The gentle promise he had made now felt like a cruel hallucination. As she sat huddled in his borrowed clothes, which now felt like a costume of foolish intimacy, his phone rang. He answered it with a clipped "Thorn" and began to pace the length of the vast window overlooking the city. His voice was a weapon, sharp, precise, and utterly ruthless. Ilara couldn't make out all the words, but the fragments she caught were brutal. Liquidate, sever the liability, their position is irrelevant. He was dismantling someone's world with the same detached efficiency with which he had installed her espresso machine. A cold dread, sharp and sickening, coiled in her stomach. This was the vulture. This was the man her world feared, the destroyer of legacies. The man who had kissed her last night was a phantom, a brief, beautiful illusion. And this cold, powerful stranger was the terrifying reality she had thrown herself at. When the call ended, a heavy, suffocating silence descended. She finally found her voice, a small, trembling thing in the cavernous room. "Julian!" He turned from the window, his expression shuddered, his eyes holding the same cool, analytical distance he'd had the first day they met in her studio. He looked at her as if she were a complex problem he had not yet solved. "My driver will be ready in 10 minutes, he said, his tone flat and dismissive. "He can take you wherever you need to go." It wasn't an offer. It was an expulsion. There was no us, no what now. There was only a transaction being concluded. He had offered her a temporary sanctuary, and now her time was up. He was retreating behind his formidable walls, and in doing so he was locking her out in the cold with a finality that was more painful than any shouted rejection. Humiliation burned through her, hot and acidic. She had fled one cage only to willingly offer herself to the master of another, a far colder and more dangerous one. She had mistaken a moment of his weakness for a promise of her salvation. Without a word, she went into the bedroom and changed back into the clothes she had arrived in, leaving his t-shirt and sweatpants folded neatly on the bed, a pathetic token of a connection that had never truly existed. She walked past him, her head held high, a desperate last-ditch effort to salvage a shred of her dignity. The silent elevator ride down from his penthouse was a descent into a new kind of hell, one of her own making. As she stepped out onto the rain-washed pavement, the city that had looked like a kingdom of glittering promise from his window now seemed like a vast, indifferent wilderness in which she was utterly and completely alone. The return to the Vance mansion was a walk of shame. The heavy oak door swung open before she could touch it, revealing her parents standing in the grand foyer like twin statues carved from ice. The air was thick, with a silence more damning than any accusation. Her father's face was a mask of cold fury, his disappointment a palpable force in the room. Her mother, Beatrice, let her gaze travel from Ilara's disheveled hair down to the simple, borrowed clothes, her lip curling in a silent expression of utter contempt. They were not seeing a daughter who had returned, but a liability that had come back to haunt them, a failed asset that had tarnished their name with its reckless, emotional display. There was no concern in their eyes, no relief that she was safe. Only the cold, hard calculus of social and financial ruin. The verdict was delivered without preamble, in the cold, funereal light of the morning room. "The Reddings have, of course, withdrawn their offer," her father stated, his voice devoid of all emotion. "The engagement is terminated. The merger is dead." He spoke as if discussing a failed business transaction, which, to him, was exactly what it was. Her mother's words were the ones that struck the deepest, each one a perfectly sharpened shard of ice aimed at Ilara's heart. "You have always been a disappointment," Beatrice said, her voice a low, venomous whisper. "So fragile, so sentimental, but I never imagined you would be so selfish as to actively destroy this family's last hope. "You have disgraced our name, Alara. You have disgraced yourself." In their eyes, she had committed the ultimate sin. She had chosen her own feelings over her family's legacy. Alone in his penthouse, Julian Thorne stood motionless before the wall of glass, staring down at the city that was his kingdom. The view offered no satisfaction. The entire, sprawling metropolis felt empty, hollowed out by the absence of the small, fragile woman who had filled his sterile space with her chaotic, beautiful emotion for just a few short hours. He saw the indentation her head had left on the pillow of his bed, the simple glass of water she had left on the table. He had pushed her away with a ruthlessness that was second nature to him, a defense mechanism honed over a lifetime of betrayal. Letting anyone close was a strategic error, a vulnerability he could not afford. Yet, the memory of her taste, the feel of her trembling surrender in his arms, was a ghost that now haunted every corner of his fortress. He had won the battle against his own weakness, but the victory felt exactly like desolation. Back in the suffocating stillness of her bedroom at the mansion, Alara felt the full weight of her consequences crash down on her. She had lost everything in a single impulsive night: her fiancé, her family's respect, her place in the only world she had ever known. She was an outcast, a pariah. The guilt was a physical thing, a heavy stone in her chest that made it difficult to breathe. She should have stayed, she should have played her part, she should have been the dutiful daughter. But as the waves of despair and self-recrimination washed over her, a new, unfamiliar feeling began to surface from the depths. It was a tiny, defiant flicker of pride. For the first time in her 24 years, she had acted not out of duty or fear, but out of a desperate, undeniable need of her own. The choice had been catastrophic, but it had been hers. She found herself walking to her studio, the one place that was still truly hers. The air inside was still, smelling of paper and pigment, and the faint, lingering scent of his cologne. On the great table, the Carta Marina Incognita lay waiting, its fractured coastlines and faded monsters a mirror of her own shattered world. Looking at it, she felt not despair, but a surge of quiet, resolute purpose. She had made a promise to restore this map, and it was the only promise she had left. She picked up a fine-tipped brush, her hand, to her own surprise, perfectly steady. She would pour her pain, her anger, and her strange, new, terrifying strength into this work. She would not mend this map for Julian Thorne, the man who had rejected her, or for her family, who had disowned her. She would mend it for herself, a quiet, painstaking act of reclaiming her own broken pieces. 3 months passed in a quiet, monastic rhythm of focused work. The world outside her studio window cycled through the last gasps of autumn and into the stark, skeletal beauty of winter. But Alara remained anchored to the vast, ink-drawn ocean on her table. The restoration of the Carta Marina Incognita became a parallel process to the restoration of her own soul. Each fractured coastline she mended, each faded sea monster she brought back to life with a delicate touch of pigment, felt like a reassembling of her own fragmented identity. She had cut off all contact with her family, ignoring their furious letters and the eventual, chilling silence. She lived on the advance Julian had paid her, a sum that felt like both a penance and a liberation. Her hands, once prone to trembling, were now impossibly steady. She was no longer hiding in her studio. She was reigning in it. The work had transformed from a refuge into a declaration of her own resilience and worth. The day she applied the final microscopic touch of gold leaf to the ornate compass rose, a profound silence descended upon the room. It was done. The map lay before her, a breathtaking testament to survival, its ancient scars not erased but integrated into its story, making it more beautiful for its history of brokenness. A wave of both triumph and a vast, aching emptiness washed over her. For months, this map had been her reason, her purpose, the singular focus that had shielded her from the wreckage of her former life. Now, its wholeness only highlighted the uncertainty of her own future. She was free, but she was adrift on an uncharted sea. She ran her fingers over the smooth, healed vellum, feeling the faint, ghost-like ridges of the old tears beneath. The map was complete. It was time to deliver it. The choice of what to do next, for the first time in her life, was entirely her own. He came on a Tuesday, as the winter sun was casting long, blue shadows across the floor. The knock on the door was different from the first time. Not an authoritative demand, but a quiet, hesitant request. When she opened it, Julian Thorne stood in the hallway, and the change in him was immediate and startling. The sharp, predatory edges seemed to have softened. He was dressed in a simple cashmere sweater and trousers, not his corporate armor, and there were faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, as if he hadn't slept properly in months. His gaze found hers and held it, and in its stormy depths she saw not the cool assessment of a collector, but the weary, searching look of a man who had lost his bearings. He looked past her to the table, to the magnificent, resurrected map, and a look of profound, humbled awe crossed his features. He saw the transformation, and he understood it was not just the parchment that had been healed. He stepped inside, and the space between them was filled not with the electric tension of their past encounters, but with the heavy, unspoken weight of shared history and profound regret. He didn't approach her, but walked directly to the map, his hands clasped behind his back as if to stop himself from touching it, from touching her. He circled the table slowly, his eyes tracing the paths of forgotten ships and the intricate coastlines she had painstakingly rebuilt. The silence stretched, filled with all the things he had failed to say that cold, cruel morning in his penthouse. Finally, his voice, lower and rougher than she remembered, broke the quiet. "You didn't just mend it," he said, his gaze still fixed on her work. "You gave it back its soul." The words were not a compliment on her skill. They were a confession, an apology, and an acknowledgement of the beautiful, living thing he had almost destroyed. Ilara felt the last of her fear dissolve, replaced by a calm, quiet strength she had earned in this room. "It wasn't just the map that was broken," she said, her voice even and clear, without a trace of accusation. "This work, it was the only way I knew how to put my own pieces back together." She finally looked at him directly, letting him see the woman she had become. Not the fragile girl who had fled to his door, but someone who had faced her own ruin and survived. At her words, the last of his formidable control seemed to shatter. He turned to face her, his eyes raw with a vulnerability that stole her breath. "I pushed you away because I destroy beautiful things, Ilara," he confessed, his voice thick with self-loathing. "It's the one skill my family perfected. I was terrified of what my world, of what point to mark the summing Comstroy would do to you." He took a hesitant step closer. "I've been living in that sterile, empty world ever since, and it's meaningless without you." He stopped, leaving a deliberate, respectful distance between them. He did not ask for forgiveness or make a grand, sweeping promise. He simply offered her the truth, a quiet, humble offering from a man who had never been humble in his life. He gestured toward the map. A world of myth and discovery spread between them. "That map represents the start of my family's legacy of theft and destruction," he said, his voice resonating with a new, quiet sincerity. "I want to start a new chart, a new history. One that begins with creation, not conquest." He finally met her eyes, and in them, she saw not a command, but a question, a plea. "Let me navigate it with you." The choice was hers. The future was an unknown territory, and for the first time, Ilara Vance looked at the vast, uncharted horizon and felt not terror, but the exhilarating, breathtaking thrill of discovery. If you believe in the power of second chances and want to see more stories of love and redemption, please subscribe, like, share, and comment on what this journey meant to you.